All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel discussion on COVID-19 and domestic violence. Thank you very much for taking the time to join. My name is Swapanti Mandalika, and I'm the Director of Constituent Services in Congressman Khanna's office. I will be moderating today's event. There's a rather concealed yet tangible connection between COVID-19 and domestic violence. Since we have sheltered in place, there has been a sharp uptick in intimate partner violence, an estimated 20% of a worldwide uptick. It's not necessarily the first thing that many people think about, but historically, in times of crisis, we have seen similar surges. The UN has called the worldwide increase in domestic violence cases a shadow pandemic. Data shows that not only does the rate of violence increase, but so does the severity. This can be attributed to a variety of factors: economic anxiety, joblessness, stress, isolation. Unfortunately, but I think most importantly, victims of domestic violence feel hopeless. They feel trapped, they feel like there is no escape, especially in a time where they have to shelter in place. So we are here today to spread awareness and discuss available resources for constituents who may be facing an intimate partner violence situation. We have a fantastic panel that will walk us through that. But before I introduce them, I would like to invite Congressman Khanna to say a few words. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Swapati. Thank you so much for your leadership in putting this together. And thank you to our extraordinary panelists, not just for participating in this panel, but for the work you do on such difficult issues. I have been aware through our staff and through talking to people in the community that unfortunately incidents of domestic violence have increased during this COVID pandemic. And it is something that we need to be empathetic towards, we need to be thoughtful about in figuring out how we can best reach people who need our help, who don't have the same options they did when we were in normal life, and how we can be a resource to them and make sure that we are standing up for their rights and standing up for their safety. And so our office looks forward to partnering with all of you who are real experts in this and seeking your guidance, seeking your advice, seeking your help. And we really look forward to collaborating on being as effective as we can be to help constituents in need. So I look forward to hearing about the panel and to getting your insights.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Now I would like to introduce our panel of speakers. In no particular order, we have Bindu Fernandez, the Executive Director at NARICA, a domestic violence support and prevention nonprofit. NARICA offers free safety, planning, counseling, legal, and other resources, support groups, job programs, and wellness programs for anyone who has experienced domestic violence. Next, we have Kalpana Peddibhotla, an immigration attorney who has advocated for victims of violence throughout her legal career and even prior to going to law school. She has worked with domestic violence organizations, providing immigration legal training for the South Asian domestic violence organization Maitri. She helped to create the first formal training for NARICA over 20 years ago, and she regularly provides pro bono consultations and services to several Bay Area domestic violence organizations. We also have Melissa Luke. She is the Associate Director of Wellness Services at Asian Americans for Community Involvement, where she oversees AKI's domestic violence and anti-human trafficking program, Asian Women's Home. Melissa has been part of the movement to end violence against women and girls for 19 years. She currently sits on the leadership teams and commissions of several organizations that advocate for domestic violence survivors and related issues. Last but not least, we have Esther Perales-Diekman. She is the Executive Director of Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence, the oldest and largest provider of domestic violence services in Santa Clara County. Over a span of 25 years, her career has included work in the public, private, and non-governmental sectors throughout the southwestern United States. From 2005 to 2017, she served as the director of the County Office of Women's Policy. She has received numerous awards for her leadership and advocacy on behalf of vulnerable communities, including women and children and survivors of gender-based violence. Thank you so much to each of you for taking the time to share your insights with us today. We really appreciate having you on this panel. So we will begin the panel discussion with a series of questions tackling various issues. We will try our best to squeeze in some questions at the very end for Q&A. If you do have questions, please type them out into the comment section of this video. So I'd like to kick off the discussion by asking each and every one of you to please tell us a little bit about your organization and the work you do. So Bindu, why don't you get us started?
Of course, thank you. And I'm so excited to be here. So NARICA started in 1992, and we were created to to support and offer wraparound services for anyone having experienced intimate partner violence or domestic abuse. The intention when it was created was to really consider the additional complexities that immigrants who are survivors of domestic violence face. And so the work that we do is intended to offer language access, legal support, among other things, for survivors of domestic violence, specifically immigrants. So what NARICA does is we do have a domestic violence helpline. It is a toll-free number that anyone in the world can call into and receive safety planning and support and services for as long as they need. And this could be 2 years, 20 years, as long as they need it. We also have support groups where groups of survivors can get together really to meet and find community in each other. We do have job programs. It is definitely something that during COVID-19, there's a lot of need for, since many of our survivors have lost their jobs. And so NARICA continues to offer a path towards financial independence with our job programs. And we always focus on wellness as well. We know that it is important and intentional that we are thinking about mental health and wellness as we offer them for our survivors and for each of us. So that's kind of the span of the services that NARICA does offer.
Thank you for sharing. Melissa, would you mind going next? Oh, Melissa, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Does that work?
Yes, that's perfect.
Perfect. Great, thank you. So thanks so much for including Aggie in this really important conversation. So we've been in the community since 1973. We are one of the largest community-based organizations focusing on vulnerable and marginalized communities. Our specific mission is to strengthen the hope and resilience of the community by improving their health, mental health, and well-being. What that means is that we have a federally qualified health center, which provides services to all, regardless of immigration status or insurance status. We have a behavioral health department, working with individuals and families of all ages. A center for survivors of torture, serving political asylees and refugees. And then wellness services, where we provide youth leadership development, senior wellness, and hot nutritional lunches. And then, of course, my program, which is the Asian Women's Home, working with survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Esther, would you mind going next?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, Next Door Solutions began in 1971. We were founded by B. Robinson Mendez, who in 1971 realized there was really no help for the situation she was in. And Next Door began its journey there. We were the second domestic violence agency established in the state of California. We were the first in the nation to provide bilingual services. So this was before there were laws to protect survivors, before any of the language that we use today existed. And so through the years, we have provided services that have taken people from crisis and violence into safety, stability, and moving them along a path with supports to self-sufficiency. So similar to other organizations, we do the same things. We meet the immediate need for crisis services, whether that's legal, restraining orders, emergency shelter, whatever the things are that people need in the moment. And then once people have the ability to have a little bit of stability, we help them sort of think through what are their next options? How do we start moving you toward a future where violence can be eradicated from your home, from your family? And what do you need to do that? So there's a wide continuum of services, legal, counseling, youth services, children's services, just a wide range of things. And again, looking at all the needs. The need for safety is foremost. when people come to Nextdoor, but along the way, we have to look at wellness, we have to look at the economic need, the job need. And so our advocates are trained to support that person in a very client-defined way. Whatever is right and whatever that person is interested in doing is what we will support. So we serve a large number of constituents here in Santa Clara County. We are predominantly, about 65% of the clients are of Latino descent, low to very low income. And so the communities we represent, the clients are very vulnerable. And so the work that we are doing evolves. It continues to evolve in light of the different policy changes, the landscape, economic downturn in the US. And so I think as domestic violence agencies, we do need a forum to come out and just kind of share what's happening. COVID has completely changed what we're doing. So we're really happy that Congressman Khanna's office has given us this opportunity to come and share what's happening.
Of course, thank you. And Kalpana?
Thank you, Nafisa, and I want to echo what Esther just said. Thank you so much, Congressman Khanna, for your leadership in inviting us all to be able to have a platform to be able to speak about these incredibly important issues. I'm a private attorney. My firm, Matthews and Peddibhotla Law Group, practices in all areas of immigration law. I've practiced law for more than 20 years, and as Supanthi mentioned at the beginning, my career has included supporting DV organizations throughout. I've also worked with other types of organizations like the ACLU, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Catholic Charities, just to name a few, in the capacity of a pro bono attorney. I invite attorneys that may be listening to this program that there is a need by these organizations to lend your support. And that's something that's been a principle of our firm, that we've throughout done something in terms of either pro bono or low bono services. It doesn't take much, but it goes in a significant way for those people that we're able to serve. And thank you for having me on this panel with these esteemed and powerful women.
Thank you, Kalpana. So Esther, can you please talk about what the impact of COVID-19 on survivors of domestic violence has been, and other forms of gender-based violence?
Thank you. I'm absolutely happy to do that. You know, one of the things that the research shows us is when there is a crisis in a community, typically a natural disaster, fire, some sort of large scale event, we tend to see violence go up. And that's because there is destabilization of family and of family networks in terms of economic displacement, loss of property, loss of life. And so the research is consistent that when those events happen in a community, violence goes up. I think the challenge under COVID-19 is, where is the evidence? What we're seeing as domestic violence agencies is the domestic violence during COVID, during the shelter-in-place orders, has continued to escalate, has intensified, but survivors have a harder time reaching us. You know, we've discussed this with the agencies really across the Bay Area. There've been about 13 of us in dialogue, and we're hearing from survivors, I can't call you. My phone is monitored, my computer is monitored. And when we've analyzed the calls, we get roughly 40 phone calls a day, anywhere between 14,000 to 15,000 every year. We initially, people were calling to ask for basic needs. They were just trying to figure out how to pay rent, how to put food on the table. And so it's sort of, that became the primary focus. But as we've analyzed the calls throughout this period, they've evolved. Then it sort of became, you know, I need to figure out what's happening in my situation. Things are getting worse here at home. So when we analyzed calls in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've realized that the calls initially dropped about 38%. People just had a harder time calling, but they've got back up to normal levels. And on some days we're seeing higher than 40, anywhere between 47 and 52 calls a day. So for Nextdoor, we definitely have seen the increase in people reaching out. About 75% of those calls are for safety planning. So we're definitely hearing from survivors that the violence is escalating, and that's to be understood. In households where there's already abusive behavior, with the stress of COVID-19, the shelter-in-place order, you know, unemployment, that has escalated the violence. And so people are now reaching out and beginning to call in the numbers that they had been before to ask, how can I connect for services? And it's something that has mystified us. We really thought that the calls would go higher, but I think we sort of underestimated how much control was happening to the victims. There have been a lot of monies that have been put out in the community. So as domestic violence agencies, we've taken a role in helping disseminate funding for COVID-19 impact, rental assistance, basic needs, and those kinds of things. We've had to change all our operation to remote. And that's been a huge challenge. And I want to give other people an opportunity to respond to the question too, but doing this work virtually presents a lot of challenges as well. So I'd be happy to have someone else jump into the conversation.
Yes, please, Bindu and Melissa, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo what Esther said in that we knew when shelter in place started that we would hear less from our survivors. Many of them were actively reaching out to tell us, do not call me, because I'm monitored, I'm in lockdown with the person harming me. And so that definitely happened. However, soon after, for our organization at least, we saw a 3-time increase from year over year. And this was through different channels of reaching out. So while historically someone may have used phone and in person, now they were using text or they were using email because they felt that was a little easier and a little more discreet than calling us. So again, when you add the two together, the fact that many people cannot reach out and the fact that there was this dramatic increase, it's really telling to a story that is half said. There is a lot more and intensified, Swapante, to your point, intense brutality and violence that is happening and kind of in a parallel world with COVID-19 as well. So that's definitely something we've seen. Many of the survivors we work with have lost their jobs. Almost all of them have lost their jobs during COVID-19. And it also, again, to Esther's point, presented an issue of, I need to make rent, I need to put food on the table, I have children, what do I do? And so those became the questions. How do I access the stimulus check? These were questions that our organization had to pivot into supporting, which we had done lesser of before or didn't anticipate. So yes, the financial aid and the support we had to give as an organization has increased really tenfold year over year, because we just knew that was the need of the hour and we had to step up to it. And all of our services immediately moved to the phone and virtually over video. And again, to Esther's point, presents issues around, one, we have a lot of our survivors who don't know how to use tech, or their tech is being monitored, or they don't have a laptop. How do you serve people if they don't have a phone and they don't have a laptop and cannot meet you in person, or their phone is taken away from them? So yes, not discreetly being able to meet with our survivors are presenting other issues. And so it is things we evolve with, but yes, NARCA's work has evolved to really do a lot of job support, job searches, job support, financial aid, food. It is another way that the organization pivoted. We've never been in the business of distributing food, and we recognized, hey, we can't, there's so much that we can do with counseling, but hey, people need food on the table. And so we've been doing almost 3 times a week, we're distributing food at the office to survivors that need it and don't have food. And some of the people we've met haven't eaten in a couple of days. And it's important that even as a community that we rise to the occasion and we are able to support organizations, especially small nonprofits, that can continue to do this work for the underserved.
Thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, so I definitely echo everything that Bindu and Esther said. I think we have also seen an escalation due to the emotional trauma of being trapped at home with an abuser. We've definitely been receiving more and more requests for counseling services and support. We have also seen survivors report a new desire to leave their situation. It can take, up to 8 times for a survivor to leave an abusive situation due to so many factors and barriers. And I think the additional challenge due to COVID is that, during normal times, if a survivor does choose to leave, the amount of emotional and practical support that is needed is a lot. It can be overwhelming. And especially now, survivors are really lacking the tools to do so in a way that is economically sustainable. Most of our clients are in the service economy, which we know has been disproportionately impacted. And just have fewer and fewer resources to move forward for themselves and for their children. I also want to echo Bindu's statement about the increase in requests through other communication channels. Next door, ACCI, and 2 other domestic violence agencies in our county run a online chat resource called safechatsv.org. We have definitely seen more survivors chatting online, and they have been telling us they're reaching out because they can't use the phone. The abuser's looking over their shoulder, or they can't use the phone to call our hotlines.
Thank you, Melissa. So can you all talk about, what services are still available, even though we're sheltering in place, and who qualifies for those services? And Melissa, feel free to kick us off for that.
Definitely. So at ACCI Asian Women's Home, all of our services are open. That's the 24/7 hotline, the shelter, our hoteling services. We have been operating our in-person center called the Family Justice Center. There are actually 3 in Santa Clara County. So survivors can make appointments or walk in to receive legal specific resources, because we of course know that legal needs, whether we're talking about in the criminal process, with family court, restraining orders, immigration, those can be huge factors in the ability of a survivor to really achieve success and self-sufficiency. So that service is open every Thursday in East San Jose. We are in the heart of Little Saigon over on Story Road by Walmart. We are continuing to provide legal, housing, all of the relevant services. I could go through the entire laundry list, but the simplest way to say it is that, please know that our services are free, confidential, open to everyone. Our hotline and the Family Justice Center are the best way to activate those resources. We provide services in 11 different, Asian, non-Asian languages and Spanish. We are open for business and we're here to help.
Esther?
Yeah, similar to ACCI, Nextdoor has all services available. I think the only thing that got impacted under the COVID-19 was our walk-in program. That's a pretty big program where people can just come in. And we hadn't been operating the walk-in services due to COVID, but in the last few weeks, we are beginning to accept walk-ins again, so that if someone's in a situation, they want to go talk to somebody and just find out what are their options, is what I'm experiencing really domestic violence, people can walk in between the hours of 9 and 5 p.m. to Nextdoor in San Jose, and they can absolutely meet with an advocate to get that. Our shelter is running. There is availability. COVID has definitely reduced our ability to take people into the shelter because we've had to distance families that are there. But like Melissa said, we have hotel and motel until a bed can become available. So every service from support groups to individual counseling and therapy, those services are all still available virtually, usually through Zoom. And so if people are out there and they're interested in connecting with Nextdoor, the best way to do that is to call our hotline, which is 408-279-2962. If you're anywhere in the district and you're not real sure how to connect with a domestic violence agency near you, you can call the National Hotline for Domestic Violence and they'll connect you. You get on Google and Google National Hotline for Domestic Violence, or if you're in the immediate Bay Area near Santa Clara County, 211. We'll also give you the list of the agencies that are there. So all the people here can be found there. So help is available. If they call your office, absolutely, they can be connected with any of us. But yeah, definitely all services are open and running. We do have a support group for men who are survivors of domestic violence. So we definitely want to encourage men who are experiencing intimate partner violence to reach out, because there is help available. There is a new LGBTQ support group as well. So regardless of what your background is, there is help for anyone.
Indu?
Yes, all services are open. They're over the phone or virtually through video. So I guess the only baseline is if you've experienced domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, you can reach out. That's really the only eligibility. We do have, of course, a cultural focus on South Asians. And so all our advocates speak a variety of Asian, South Asian languages and are able to assist with language and a cultural responsive lens. We do have counseling. We do have our domestic violence helpline. We do offer support groups virtually. We do have job support with receiving support there, wellness, and currently, as I said before, we do have groceries and a bit of financial aid that we're able to support with as well. So anyone can reach out through our website, through our phone number or our email. All services, again, to everyone's point, is free and confidential. We will either, any of the services we can do in-house, we will. Otherwise, we know people we can refer to as well. So please reach out. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bindu. So Congressman, a question came in for you that I'd love for you to answer. Can you tell me what you and your cohorts are doing about policy and legislation that enforces penal action against domestic violence offenders and intimate terrorists and legislative efforts that protects victims of domestic violence? And this is from Candace.
Well, thank you, Swati. I can speak to that and more broadly what we're doing in Congress. I mean, first, most urgently, we're in the appropriations process, and we are making sure that domestic violence programs like the ones that Kalpana, Melissa, Bindu, Esther have been talking about are funded, and that we need funding for transitional housing because transitional housing is so important for victims of domestic violence. We're also doing things to increase safety for domestic violence. We're on legislation that would make sure people are who feel threatened that their assailants don't get access to a firearm. We're making sure that they have extra safety precautions when they are going to file a protective order. We're looking to figure out how we can get additional funding for the types of programs that many of you have talked about. And to the person's question, we need to treat domestic violence with the seriousness of any, just like we treat any hate crime, just like we treat any assault based on a person's status, and that there needs to be enforcement and prosecution, and that is something that there are a number of bills that we are on. But I've been so appreciative of this panel conversation. I know it's going to go on a little longer for our constituents, but I already have heard some good ideas, and I hope at the end of this you will work with Swapanti to see if there are other things we can be doing in Congress legislatively, and most importantly for everyone listening. I hope you will contact our office if we can be of help. If you want our help to contact another office or another nonprofit that can help, we will do that. But we really need all of your help to serve the community. So thank you again, Kalpana, and Melissa, Bindu, and Esther, and thank you, Swapanti.
Thank you, Congressman. So, we're very proud of having a very large immigrant population in CA17 in Congressman Khanna's district. So we have several questions geared toward that demographic. Melissa, if you can start off by telling us why culturally responsive services are so important, that would be great.
Sure. So culturally responsive services are important because of the added complexities faced by our diverse communities. I think our communities face huge barriers due to systemic inequities. Survivors are unable to access care and assert their legal rights. In terms of the barriers that our clients face, there are certainly barriers around language access. There's a lack of knowledge around supports available and how to access them. There is, especially in this political climate, the fear around the impact on themselves and their families, their communities if they reach out. That can be in particular due to their immigration status. Also their partners oftentimes use immigration status as a tactic of abuse. It is very common to threaten an immigrant survivor that if they try to seek support, leave the situation, they'll be deported, they'll be separated from their American-born children, and they won't have any financial resources to support themselves and their kids. When we look at the gaps in systems and the gaps in cultural responsiveness, we're definitely looking at doing more trainings and systems around the unique needs of these communities. Oftentimes we see because that training is lacking, survivors can be denied service or be sent on a very frustrating journey, seeking and failing to receive support from agency to agency. I think that we have a lot of different resources at ACCI due to our, triple focus on health and wellness. But of course we don't have everything. And, the most frustrating situation for us is when we refer a survivor out to a different resources system, and they get referred back to us because they're Asian. I think that, when you look at the disproportionate impacts of this lack of language access and this lack of understanding, I always think about one survivor we were working with who was caught in the child protective system. The child was taken away, and there was a lot of miscommunication between mom and the social worker. There were language barriers, cultural misunderstandings. To share just one instance, our client thought the social worker would find counseling for her and parenting support so that she would be able to be reunited with her child, who was barely a year old. This is a tiny kid and just a really, really terrible situation for that family. So she misheard. The social worker did not find that help. She did not find that help for herself. And at the hearing, she was non-compliant. She was unable to reunite with her child. So really, I think that, it's very important to create this clear understanding of rights and resources with our communities. And that lack of understanding can really cause huge damage to our communities. When we talk about cultural responsiveness, we're looking at having advocates from the same culture who speak the same language fluently. We're looking at systems and services that have low barriers to access, right? Systems that don't look at immigration status, that don't look at income. They don't require official documentation like a police report, because we know our communities, they tend not to report abuse through official channels. They're afraid of systems, of law enforcement. There's cultural stigma around airing your dirty laundry. So just being aware of all of those dynamics is critically important. And then, as several of us mentioned earlier, definitely we need to raise awareness of those services that are free and confidential. And speaking for the domestic violence agencies, it's really important to share that it really is confidential, except for a few key situations. But we don't report to law enforcement. We don't report to ICE. When there are family members who may be calling in to stalk a survivor and their family, we don't share any of that information. And hopefully that, saying that can put survivors at ease and let communities know that, that these resources are available.
Thanks, Melissa. I know that each of you work with different demographics of immigrants. So Bindu and Esther, what are, additional complexities that immigrants face around domestic violence? What have some of your encounters sort of showed in that area?
I mean, I want to echo everything Melissa said. She said it beautifully. There is, of course, language access. Additionally, I want to say things like with immigration abuse, a lot of what we see is even lies around a person's immigration status. So the person causing harm may say, you're on a visa that doesn't allow you to drive. It doesn't allow you to work. And maybe it does. And sometimes, of course, it doesn't. But just the system of, I'm in a foreign country, I will listen to this person who is my partner and my spouse in order to tell me what things are happening. Many times our survivors have never seen their immigration papers. They do not have access to their passport. They have not seen the passport of their children. It is being held by one person. And then much later, if that person leaves or abandons them, they suddenly are left with really no sense of what status they have in the US. So there's a lot of finesse to the immigration facilitated abuse that continues to happen. Financial abuse continues to be a big one where really one person controls. It is a collectivist attitude of many immigrant cultures of, hey, there are roles, there are gender roles, and one person controls the finances, and I trust that person. And so even if I work, I will put it in a bank account that I don't have access to, and I have to ask this person for money every week or every month and get a budget for it. So all of these things I think play in a little more with our immigrant survivors. Abandonment is a very, very, very big issue. NARCA continues to see with our survivors where someone will, one person will take the other person to their home country on a vacation to meet the family again, and then leave them there, and then come back with their child often, and then serve divorce papers internationally. And now you're in this system where this person is in their home country, the other person with their child is in the US, And really that person has no way of coming back because they don't have their immigration papers. They don't know any way to get back to the US. And a lot of our calls are such. They're abandoned sometimes on the side of the street in the US. Sometimes they're abandoned in their home country. Sometimes they're just like suddenly poof, the person's gone. And you really have no way of knowing how to stay in the US. So we see a lot of that. And I think it does present a lot of issues for our immigrant survivors. One last thing I'll mention is just social networks. I moved to the US 7 years ago, and the only family I have is my husband. And well, when you consider that family where, well, I left my friends behind, I left the rest of my family behind, if that person starts to abuse or harm you, what social structure and systems do you have? You really don't have a confidant, you don't have friends you can talk to, and that isolation that is created from really being in another country that isn't your own, where everything feels foreign to you, where you're afraid of law enforcement even more, where your opinions of law enforcement is based on your opinions of law enforcement in your home country. These are all things that where our immigrants make those assumptions of, oh, well, law enforcement in my country was this way, so I assume it is the same here, and can lead, and of course with additional worries like deportation, can lead to them never reaching out. And so of course what Narika continues to do is to say, hey, it is confidential. You don't need to make decisions like calling law enforcement, to Melissa's point, and just say, hey, we're just here for you. It's to have a conversation and a dialogue about how we can work towards your safety through the process.
Great. Esther?
I agree with everything that's being said so far, especially the idea that for the immigrant population, domestic violence is linked to, those outcomes that are poor health, trauma, PTSD, in the longer term space. What we're seeing with the immigrant survivors that we serve is sort of multiple layers of trauma. The idea that they're living in domestic violence situations, but that's not to say violence wasn't already a part of their lives in their home countries. It led to migration to the US, which itself, the journey of migration is fraught with a lot of violence and a lot of exposure to violence for the person and for the children. And so I think what we're seeing is really escalated mental health needs in a very unique way for immigrants, because they're already processing violence that they've been exposed to on top of violence that's currently happening. The immigration climate, the legal system, all those are things that are very complicated for survivors. So the need for lawyers, for attorneys who can navigate those complex systems under changing conditions, because I think what we're seeing is trends where we sort of have an opening here, then the opening is closed. Now you're not allowed to do this. Can I qualify and ask for public assistance? Those are all things that the survivor has to constantly navigate. The other piece is, for our clients, we have low and very low income clients that we serve, predominantly Latino. They're working in the service sector, as Melissa mentioned earlier. And we know those are sectors that are particularly impacted by COVID. If you think about these families, many of them are living multiple families in a single household. And so the ability to socially distance, that's very hard. So we definitely see rates in Santa Clara County where the vulnerable communities are at much higher risk. Locally, Latinos make up about 27% of the population, but they make up 47% of the positive COVID cases. So we're really concerned that our vulnerable communities, especially when they're survivors of domestic violence, are facing new threats and just this very unpredictable circumstance right now that's constantly evolving. So working with survivors, that business has gotten very complex. Hanging on to people who can navigate those systems and provide support becomes a challenge for our organization. So partnership, partnership, partnership. We can't, as Melissa mentioned, we can't do it all by ourselves. We have to build networks that are trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and are sensitive to the circumstances that seem to be constantly changing for immigrants.
Definitely, thank you. So, many immigrants feel as though they don't have rights, that unless they are a US citizen, they're not protected by the law. So Kalpana, you possess such a broad knowledge base and bring years of immigration law-related experience with you. Can you please explain what the legal framework for domestic violence is?
Sure. Thank you for the question. First, I'm going to pick up on something that Melissa said about cultural stigma, and I think it's important that we we continue to reframe these issues a bit. So as a starting point, I think it's critical that we understand that these issues of violence go beyond just the individuals that are involved. And that's not just an issue between, it's not just an issue between husband and wife or parent and child, but rather what happens in these violent households have an impact on our children, on our communities, and for our public safety. And it's for that reason that prosecution of domestic violence, like other crimes, is by the state. In other words, it's the people versus the domestic violence perpetrator. And I think this distinction is important as a starting point, especially since victims of violence often feel guilty and the perpetrators blame them if they are prosecuted. The abuser will say something like, oh, she sent me to jail. And I think it's important that we stand up and say, no, it's your actions that sent you to jail and our government prosecuted you. So I think it's critical to step back and understand that somebody is not at fault for what another person does to them. And that prosecution is a result of that other person's action.
Great, thank you. And what are some of the laws that help to protect immigrant women in particular?
Well, the primary ones that come in terms of protecting immigration status, they arise from the Violence Against Women's Act. And so these protections, though, are different depending upon the immigration status of the domestic violence survivor and their abusive spouse. So while I don't want to get too technical, I think these distinctions are actually critical for understanding, and hopefully people who are hearing this program will be able to help maybe somebody in these various immigration statuses. So for example, the spouses of US citizens and lawful permanent residents have an independent pathway towards the green card under the Violence Against Women's Act, or what I'll call VAWA for shorthand. This pathway does not require criminal prosecution of the abusive spouse and can largely be documented through the DV survivor's declaration and other supporting evidence. That was step one with VAWA. For the dependent spouses, though, of non-immigrant visa holders, such as the spouses of H-1B holders, L-1s, just to name a few, or for undocumented immigrant women, while they don't have the same pathway as the prior group, they do have certain protections, again, starting from VAWA. And those began in the year 2000, but unfortunately were not implemented for nearly a decade later. And that's the UVisas for victims of certain crimes, which include domestic violence, T visa for victims of trafficking, and more recently, temporary work authorization, which we call the VAWA EAD, Violence Against Women's Act Employment Authorization Document. These visas provide at least an initial critical answer for those individuals who are not married to a permanent resident or US citizen. And frankly, with the huge backlogs for green cards, especially in the Chinese and the Indian communities, people are not getting their green cards from those countries very quickly. So they are often in relationships where the principal is on an H-1B and the dependent is relying upon them on the H-4. And so the U visa can provide a critical independent pathway towards ultimately the green card.
Thank you. So oftentimes there is hesitation to involve law enforcement in domestic violence situations for a number of reasons. Does someone have to report a crime to the police in order to have these immigration protections?
No, and I think that's important. That's a great question, and the answer is no, not necessarily. So I think the goal behind these laws was to provide a pathway that was not necessarily impeding the immigration status for DV survivors so that they can leave those violent circumstances. So for example, under VAWA, the spouse of a US citizen and the green card holder can self-petition without having to first file a police report. And this is important for them to be able to get out of that household where they may be using the immigration status to further their power and control over that DV survivor. Or with VAWA EAD, they don't have to have the police report, and they can pursue an independent employment authorization document. And this is super important, especially for where somebody is not earning any income because they're a dependent spouse of somebody, let's say somebody on an H-1B. If they get the VAWA EAD, it may allow them to get financial stability, financial independence. And then at that point, they may be able to pursue, report the actions to the police. And even with the UVisa, and this is sometimes misunderstood, that the UVisa requires a police report, where the law actually permits that in family court, a judge who is presiding over, let's say, a temporary restraining order, they can actually support that the DV survivor in pursuing their U visa without having to have first pursued it with the police. And again, I think there's many steps in this process, meaning that while somebody may not be ready to make the police report initially, and they could do it later on, ways the immigration law intersects to provide some initial protections to get somebody out of that household to safety, and then in the future pursue legal recourse through the criminal justice system.
Sure. And, we have thousands of residents in our district who are on non-immigrant visas and, pending green card applications. Do you think dependent visa holders are more prone to being subject to domestic violence?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if they're more prone to DV, and I would leave that to, these other women on the panel who are much more familiar with it and work day in and day out with DV survivors. But I do think that they have unique challenges that are different than US citizens and permanent residents. And in particular, I think several people have touched on this already, and that is the way that immigration status is held over somebody's head, and where the ways in which immigration documents are controlled, passports are seized, immigration status documents are taken. Those are ways to try to assert control over a domestic violence victim. And that's important because essentially your immigration documentation is critical to your ability to remain in the United States. And if somebody's controlling that, then they are asserting a unique type of harm to you that's separate and different from somebody who's a US citizen or a permanent resident. And I think this is especially critical right now, where the news is flooded almost every single day with changes in our immigration laws, our policies, our how the administration reacts, and it creates a lot of fear in the immigrant community, and especially a vulnerable population who may be in an abusive relationship. And I think that that is for sure an advantage that an abuser may take over somebody else to continue to assert control as their immigration status.
Thanks, Kalpana. So, much of the work of domestic violence agencies centers on intervention after violence has taken place, or, when violence is taking place. What are some efforts happening that are designed to prevent violence? So, Bindu, if you can start us off with that.
Sure. I will say a lot of our community outreach efforts and wellness efforts are intended to be a platform for people to understand about domestic violence and abuse. It is often that historically people understand abuse to be a bruised eye and bruises. That is a common understanding of violence and abuse, but really to have places where we discuss what does abuse constitute, the coercion and the power related to abuse, and less of just our historic understanding of it. So really prevention, in my opinion, is a lot about if we're aware and we name and we understand together as a community what abuse and domestic violence and power and control is, then we are in a better place to really seek support and understand in ourselves. So I would say all of our community outreach efforts, a panel like this, these are all intended to really be part of prevention work and ensure that more people understand what abuse is, what is constituted an abuse. One of the new initiatives we are resurfacing as an organization is our youth program. And we've historically had youth programs where we're working either with children in DV families and really supporting them through their journey, and or really just to work with our young adults and our teenagers about things like teen dating violence and partner violence and abuse, which happens a lot. And so the program we are resurfacing during COVID-19 is really an effort to have age-appropriate resources around touch and consent and healthy relationships, and really work towards that and create more awareness at both levels for our adults as well as for our 18 and under as well. Yeah.
Sure. Melissa and Esther, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's really important. You know, a lot of the times as a society, we ask, well, why doesn't she just leave him? But we never stop to ask, you know, why doesn't that person, or why doesn't he stop committing the abuse? The idea of engaging men and boys is something that's been lacking in the field of domestic violence for many, many years. And it's exciting to see organizations are starting to do more in that area. This past year, we were able to pilot and implement a curriculum called Coaching Boys into Men. And it's built on the idea that for athletes, one of the most influential people in their lives is their coach. A lot of times they'll pay more attention to what the coach says than their own mom and dad. And so we set out in partnership with Eastside Union High School to train 24 coaches and to expose 240 student athletes to the curriculum. And so unfortunately, COVID interrupted a lot of that work, but we were able to complete getting into schools and doing that initial training. It was received very well. What we were excited about is the coaches definitely saw it was a way to have a conversation with their athletes about healthy relationships, respect, communication. What I think the surveys that sort of are troubling to us is the idea that a healthy relationship is not very understood by many young people. Their ideas about what is a relationship are not necessarily healthy. And, you know, with the work we do with young people, it's also surfacing that they're very young, you know, 12 years old and already engaged in relationships that are not healthy. So a prevention idea is also tinged with the idea that youth are exposed to a lot of violence. But we think we need to go, you know, further upstream and definitely try to work with younger populations, definitely partner with people that are not traditional. We've been doing a lot of work with churches, with health centers, to look at how do we identify, support, and help people connect with the agencies that exist to help with domestic violence. We're doing a lot of work in partnership with lots of groups, including ACCI, about the connection between DV and health. And, you know, Melissa's organization happens to be in the unique position of being a DV agency with a health clinic. So I think it would be great for her to just kind of share what she's seeing from her vantage point.
Please go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. I can definitely speak to our mutual work in that area. So as Esther said, we do have our federally qualified health center and our, you know, domestic violence and human trafficking program on site. And, you know, with Next Door's support, we have been promoting what is called the CUES model through Futures Without Violence. Essentially, it's, you know, it's the idea that we need to normalize conversations around family dynamics and reframe this conversation around health, around healthy outcomes for ourselves and for our children. So, you know, the idea is that we're not doing, you know, what you may think of as traditional health screening, which historically have been pretty invasive and traumatizing, you know, asking about physical impacts. Have you been hit in the last 6 months? Have you been sexually, you know, abused? Just really hard conversations to have in any setting. And it really is around destigmatizing, normalizing conversations, having a health provider, you know, be the trusted voice to say, how is your relationship going? You know, have you seen some of these factors in your interactions? Please know that if you have any questions, that you can speak to me, your trusted health provider, or that we can refer to a trusted domestic violence resource, you know, to talk about the very complex issues we've touched on during this call. And, you know, I think for ACCI in particular, we've been looking at this evidence-based focused intervention, also with an eye to cultural responsiveness. So, you know, we have definitely seen that for our API communities that there's a little bit of there's some tweaking that needs to be done kind of to the mainstream intervention, which, you know, I think for those of us who do this work, that's pretty typical, right? Evidence-based models are usually based on evidence and research in non-communities of color and in mainstream communities. So that's where we really feel that we in Nextdoor can have a voice working in those communities.
Thank you, Melissa. And Bindu, can you please talk about what people should do if they hear about abuse or witness abuse? How should you react? What are some steps that you can take as a friend or a coworker or just a witness?
Of course, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. I would say it's important to listen. Again, easier said than done, to listen without the intent to respond or to solve, but really to listen for listening's sake. And really to be there for that person through everything. Many times our survivor needs support in various forms. They may need a drive to the grocery store. They may need food at their doorstep. So really to not assume what that person wants in response, but really to say, hey, what is it you want? How can I support you? How can I help you? And not to, so I would start there. I would start with just listening. It is helpful at some point to consider whether they're willing to speak with a DV agency and to counselors and experts in DV who are able to support them through all of the needs they have. So really knowing as an ally or a friend, knowing that domestic violence agencies exist, all of us, and to really be able to reach out to us if should that survivor need it would be something to look for. And I think, learn and read about domestic violence. It's a deeply complex space. It is inherent in a lot of our structures. There's a lot of power in all of our relationships and everywhere that we show up within work, at home, as a parent. It's important to recognize that within ourselves and within others as well. So really to kind of take the time and the space to learn a lot more about domestic violence and be a better friend and ally to that person and meet them where they are without judgment and with love and with compassion and support is what I'd recommend.
Sure, thank you. And I know we're running low on time, so I wanted to give our panelists the opportunity to provide brief closing remarks. So Bindu, if you just wanted to start us off with that, then we can just go around the room.
Absolutely, thank you. I do want to make a quick plug for a domestic violence training that we have starting in August. It's a virtual cohort. It's a 40-hour training. If anyone wants to really understand a lot more about domestic violence or volunteer in this space as a counselor, I'd recommend looking at our website and signing up for our August DVAT, Domestic Violence Advocate Training that we're launching. Like I mentioned before, read up about domestic violence, understand it for what it is. Nobody is exempt, regardless of your age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. So really recognize that it could be a friend, it could be a sibling, it could be a daughter or a son that it happens to. And really, like, just because we pretend it isn't happening, it doesn't mean it isn't. It's just behind closed doors, and we're afraid to talk about it because it means looking ourselves in the mirror. So really understand it and learn a lot more about it. Volunteer. The best service anybody can do in the community is to volunteer your time. It is your biggest act of love. So really consider what you are an expert at, whether it's legal, whether it's marketing, whether it's finances. Every nonprofit needs some more hands to do this work and to hold this work together. So really consider how you can volunteer and whether you can volunteer your space and your influence. I would also call on anyone who has circles of influence. If you are a religious leader, if you work at a business, if you are a coach, whoever you are, consider that really your voice in this movement will support this movement going forward. So really spend that time considering and learning about DV and volunteering this space. And the last thing I'll say is donate. Please donate generously to a nonprofit of your choice, to a cause that matters to you. A lot of nonprofits, especially the small ones, are truly suffering with just the weight of COVID-19 and the uncertainty of finances for our organizations. So please donate till it hurts and donate recurring continuously to any of our organizations, to a cause that matters to you, because it makes an impact and it helps us continue to do the work we do. And for the DVAT training, all of the information is on the website to volunteer or donate to be a part of that training. So please look at our website, narika.org, and you'll have more details there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bindu. Kalpana?
So, thank you. I'll be really quickly. There was somebody who I think asked in the chat if they were worried about reporting having terrible consequences on their immigration status. So I just want to make sure people hear this, that there are multiple legal tools that are available to protect their status. And in fact, the changes that have occurred over the last decade in immigration law has literally been geared toward encouraging people to reporting. So, and reporting is not necessarily the first step you have to take in order to protect your immigration status. I also want to make a quick plug, since this was brought up earlier as well, and that's advocating for tougher sentences, as well as for programs that change this behavior, programs that change these violent behaviors, and recognizing that this is not just between the intimate partners, but it's a crisis in our communities and should be addressed in that fashion. And finally, thank you, Swapanthi, and my fellow panelists and the Congressman for allowing us to have this program. Appreciate it.
Of course, thank you, Kalpana. Melissa?
I want to echo the thanks to Congressman Khanna, Swapanthi, and Keisha for facilitating this conversation. You know, I think my final word would be just speaking directly to survivors and people, loved ones who are supporting those survivors. I want to reemphasize that, you know, services at all of our domestic violence agencies are confidential. They're free. They're open to all, regardless of your immigration status for ACCI, whether you're Asian or non-Asian. And they're open to survivors and support people. Because we do receive numerous calls from support people who are looking for resources to support their loved ones. Our 24-hour hotline is 408-975-2739. You can also reach us through SafeChat, that's safechatsv.org. We have our Family Justice Center on Story Road in East San Jose, open every Thursday night at 5. You know, and really invite folks who are just starting to consider these conversations, who are exploring what their rights and options might be. You can come to the Family Justice Center to just learn more about those immigration resources and talk more about your rights. There's no commitment to moving forward. We're, you know, here to discuss, to support, to provide resources and options.
Thank you, Melissa. Esther?
I think just to close out, I want to thank everyone in the Congressman's office for allowing us to be here with you today. I will say that everybody wants to do something right now, and there's been suggestions made that are excellent. Financial contributions are huge for us right now because we expect the economic downturn is going to hit us pretty hard. If you're somebody who likes to read and learn, definitely get familiar with the issue. There is the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, CPEDV, that has an eye on what's happening across the state of California in the issue of domestic violence. You can connect with our organizations, also nationally, the National Network to End Domestic Violence. We should be pushing for funding at the city level, county level, the state level, and the federal level. One of the most urgent things that I think the Congressman's office can be a help to us is the CARES Act provided somewhere in the neighborhood of $45 million in support for those of us working in the area of gender-based violence. We want to make sure that the economic needs of survivors, especially housing and other supports, are included in any new stimulus packages that are coming. So if you're an armchair political analyst, get active, advocate, support the work that's happening across the state of California. We'll be happy to be on the front lines to serve our community, but it takes resources and support for us to keep doing that, and we need your help. So anything that people need, you can call any of our agencies, and we'd be happy to talk that through with you.
Thank you so much, Esther. And right before we log off, I just want to share my screen so you can see the contact information for all of our wonderful panelists and their organizations. And you know, before we end, I just want to take a moment to thank each of our panelists for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to spend time with us and share your invaluable insights with our constituents. We're deeply appreciative of the work that all of you are doing for our community, and we look forward to continued partnership. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Thank you for your interest and participation. Thanks to Congressman Khanna for your passion for the subject. And last but not least, thank you to our staff members, Lakeisha Bryant and Emma Preston, for co-organizing and planning this event. Thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take good care, everyone.
Bye.